The second example that we're going to consider in our study of courage is that of Joseph. Joseph had the courage in Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 through 12, to maintain his purity when he was tempted to compromise his morals. When his master's wife seduced him, this young man refused to yield, choosing instead to act in such a way that would be pleasing to God. Friends, we live in a society today in which immorality is common. Premarital sexual relations, adultery, homosexuality, pornography are all running rampant. And we need to have the courage to maintain our purity in the midst of this crooked and perverse generation. Joseph's example shows us how to do this. We remember that Joseph was the favored son of his father. And although the parent is to blame when such favoritism is shown, the resentment by Joseph's siblings was directed toward Joseph rather than toward their father. And this was what happened in this case. Their brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than the rest of the brothers, and so they hated him, and they were not on friendly terms with each other. Joseph's brothers hated him even more, though, when he began to have dreams that showed that they would all bow down to him. And they did not like the fact that Joseph was positioning himself in this position of prominence. But what they failed to realize was that these dreams were actually revelations of prophecies that were coming from God. Well, after these dreams, Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers who were out in the flock with their sheep in the area of Shechem. Well, when his brothers saw him, they planned to take advantage of this opportunity and take Joseph's life. Well, after Reuben intervened and convinced the brothers to simply throw him in a pit instead. Well, Reuben had the plan that he would come back later on and rescue Joseph. But the other brothers, they decided instead to sell Joseph to some traders that were passing by. And these traders brought Joseph into Egypt and sold him into slavery to Potiphar, who was Pharaoh's officer, the captain of his bodyguard. Well, while he was serving Potiphar, he was tempted to commit fornication with Potiphar's wife. So why did this take courage on his part? Well, given Joseph's circumstances, there are at least 5 reasons why it took courage for Joseph to maintain purity and resist the temptations of Potiphar's wife. First, the temptation was to fulfill a natural desire which God had instilled in man. God created man in such a way that he would desire this type of relationship. However, just because such a desire was given by God does not mean that man has license to fulfill that desire in any way that he pleases. The writer of Hebrews said that marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Hebrews 13 and verse 4. It would have been natural for Joseph as a young man to have the desire for this type of relationship, yet it would have been sinful to desire that relationship with another man's wife. Secondly, Joseph was the only God-fearing person in this area. The Egyptians certainly were religious, but they did not serve the true and living God. Those who believed in God sold him into slavery. Joseph could have easily turned against God because of him. He could have reasoned that there was no point in following God when no one else there was following him. We're reminded in the example of Peter that it's much easier to boldly proclaim one's faith when among like-minded friends than it is to do so when standing alone among those in this world. Third, this temptation was regular and persistent. Potiphar's wife did not just tempt Joseph one time and then leave him alone after he refused her advances. This was something that she did day after day in an attempt to wear Joseph down to the point that he would give in. Fourth, Joseph may have been able to sin without others finding out. After the temptations had been going on for some time, an opportunity presented itself in which Joseph might have been able to give in without anyone else knowing. No one was home except Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and this would have been the ideal time to commit fornication with her without anyone else finding out. And fifth, this temptation had reached the point in which Joseph could no longer just say no. At the final temptation, the situation had become such that a simple no was no longer sufficient, for she had become physical with him, had taken him by his garment, He could have said no, and she would have still been there clinging to his clothing. But more was needed to resist this temptation, so he left his garment in her hand, and he fled. Joseph took courage. He knew that this was not something that was acceptable. In order to maintain his purity, he had to turn away from these advances, and even though it meant that ultimately he would end up in prison, he had to stand for what he knew was right, and he would not allow himself to be tempted in this way. And this is why Joseph asked the question, how then could I do this great and evil sin against God? Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today. Please consider these things from the life of Joseph, and have a blessed day.